In this segment, I want to talk about Middle East as an exotic, quote-unquote, area. In 1986, Gallup poll asked Americans to identify the Middle East on the world map. 75% of Americans were unable to do this. Then, in the winter of 1991, the first war with Iraq, after Iraq invaded Kuwait, the stores were selling out of Middle East map because suddenly everyone had a surge of interest in where Iraq was and where our troops were going. But soon again, the public forgot about the Middle East. But then again, in 2011, we got interested again. And yet, an interesting data will show you this episodic interest of our public in the Middle East. If you look at the poll that I'm presenting on my slide, you will see that in May 2006, that is 3 years after the invasion of Iraq, 2/3 of American adults could not locate Iraq or Saudi Arabia, our important ally there, in the Middle East map, on the Middle East map. 3/4 could locate neither Iran nor Israel, and yet by this time we are considering Iran to be the most important threat to the United States. The point of all of these data is to communicate to you that America's interest in the Middle East is not sustained. It depends on what's going on, and then soon they forget about this. And if you focus only on the American public, there is a deceiving element here, because the problem is not just with the American public. In fact, many of the so-called experts, quote unquote, whether self-proclaimed or otherwise, especially among Americans, see Middle East in what I would call a stereotypical terms. In other words, they have a distorted view of the Middle East as well. So my task in this course is to bring the Middle East to life for you. How do the people of the area see each other? That's one of the things we have to accomplish. The other one is, why do they hate each other? That is an important understanding if we are to be able to make sense of the kind of conflicts that exist between various groups, not just Arab Israelis, but between Iranians and Arabs, between Turks and Arabs, and many others. And then finally, how we in the West see the Middle Eastern people and how we see their conflicts and its causes. So part of my job is to address these questions. And without a doubt, this can be confusing. So the challenge facing us in this course is to be able to make sense of the apparent chaos. And I use that word advisedly. You hear that a lot from American journalists. A common mantra about the so-called inscrutability of the Middle East is this. After they give their reports about what's going on in Syria, in Egypt, or in Iran, they end their observation in the following way. But then again, that is the Middle East. As if the Middle Easterners represent a species distinct from the Homo sapiens. My task is to tell you that they really are not that different from the rest of us. The way they're seen as different is the distortions that we carry with us, looking at them and trying to understand the conflicts. So that's my challenge. The challenge for you, however, is to erase what you know, at least temporarily, and have you look at the Middle East and its people through a different eyes. To do so, it demands nothing less than a radical Gestalt switch on your part, on the way you see the Middle East, on the way you imagine the Middle Easterners, and on the way you see this region as so conflict-ridden that it is an outlier, without any question. The fact of the matter is that nearly all of us have distorted view of the Middle East. And probably the best way I can communicate this is to begin by identifying some of the factors that are contributing to the distorted imagery of the Middle Eastern people, of the Middle Eastern countries that we have. So what I want to begin with is identifying the sources of distortion in the West's image of the Middle East. In other words, I'm talking about the Western prejudices when they look at the Middle East. And I have these broken down into several factors. The first one, of course, is the ancient historians. In the West, we really do get the prejudices of the Greeks and the Romans. So what are those prejudices? Well, if you look at the way Greeks viewed the people of the region outside their own people, they viewed them as, quote, barbarians. Barbarian is very important because later on in this course I'm going to discuss the barbarian stereotype. That stereotype almost speaks volume about how you see people, but not only that, how you think one should deal with these people. In other words, it has a direct impact on the kind of policies we are likely to support. Another part of ancient history is the Old Testament in Torah. It offers a history of the area. But remember, this is dead and ancient history. It won't be able to teach you much about today's Middle East. So the first source of the distortion comes from the ancient historians. And these are the kind of prejudices we inherit when we study our own civilization. The second source of distortion for the West is, of course, the Crusades. The 12th century, romantic and a very exciting period. Movies have been made about the Christian knights fighting the Muslim hordes, and all they have done is to perpetuate the stereotype of the Muslims, the good guy, the bad guys. So the crusade is another source of distortion because it was a kind of a noble war for us dealing with the barbarians. The third source of distortion has to do with what I call the agony of the Jews. When the Jews left their ancient homeland in the Middle East, they had some really hideous moments and experiences in the lands that they migrated to, and particularly in Europe. Therefore, one truly must be insensitive not to feel for what has happened to them. When some of them decided to go back to the Middle East, they went to an area that was already populated, and so in order to stay, they had to fight these people. As they began to settle in the area, like the Greeks and the Romans, the Jews too constructed view of the Arabs with which they felt comfortable with. In other words, they began to see them as culturally inferior. So that further adds to the distortion of the West regarding the Middle East. The next topic is the European colonization of much of the Middle East. The imperial era really ranks as one of the most aggressive episode in human history. It began in the 18th century and lasted well into the 20th century. When I say well into the 20th century, if you think of the Algerian Revolution, where Algeria tried to free itself from France, it really didn't end till 1961. What I want to do is to actually read a quote from a Middle Eastern analyst by the name of Ram Khoury. Let me read you the quote. From the days of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt 2 centuries ago to the birth of the modern Middle East state system at the European colonial hands a century ago, a steady stream of Western armies invade, occupy, and seek to remake the Middle East to suit Western strategic aims. This phenomena captures the way certainly the Middle Easterners view the history of their country and their dealing with the West. So how did the colonialism begin? There is a famous saying that is attributed to Sir John Seeley that the British Empire was acquired in a, quote, fit of absent-mindedness. What did he mean by that? I think what he meant was that there was no master plan or a blueprint for colonial adventures and colonial expansion. Rather, once the first colonies were established, then the concern for their security and their borders led to the creation of buffer zones and more colonies, and next thing you know, you had pretty much conquered a good chunk of the real estate in the world. So whether by design or accident, in the 19th century, the British Empire ruled over 1/4 of the world population. At its peak, prior to World War I, the British Empire was twice the size of the Roman Empire. And if you include all the West, the Western Europe really at that time ruled over some 84% of the land on the globe. So you know this was a terrifically important phenomenon. So European colonization is very, very crucial to our understanding and our dealing with the Middle East. Much of the colonization actually really embraced the Middle East and Africa. So Western European functionally had colonized good part of the Middle East, and in that context, I want to read you a second quote, and I won't tell you who this is by till later. Let me read you the quote. This is not by a Middle Easterner, it's by a Harvard professor. Quote, "The West won the world not by the superiority of its ideas or values or religion, to which few members of the other civilization were converted, but rather by the superiority in applying organized violence. Westerners often forget this fact. Non-Westerners never do." So can you guess who was the author? He wrote a book called The Clash of Civilization. His name is Samuel Huntington, and you find this quote on page 51. And a lot of people view Samuel Huntington actually harboring a stereotype view of the Middle East and the clash of civilization. And yet, that statement is one that is oftentimes invoked by a lot of Middle Easterners to remind the West of their dealings with them. So when the European colonialists finally began leaving the area in the first half of the 20th century, they had already redefined the physical shape of much of the Middle East. And to date, we are still witnessing the consequences of those redefinitions. One consequence of the colonial legacy is simply the weakness of the state's structure in many of the former colonies. In other words, the former colonies have a weak state. That doesn't mean they don't have a brutal state, but the functioning as a government is weak. The challenge emanated from the fact that we were trying to transform entities that were really artificial, created by imperialists, by the European colonialists, into a modern state system. That challenge really never was met. Think of it this way. The boundaries of these arbitrary states were drawn to satisfy the interests of the colonial powers and their wheelings and dealings among each others. So you will see later on that just the creation of Iraq involves negotiation between Russia, France, and Britain to decide what part belongs to whom. In other words, these boundaries had nothing to do with the creation of a viable political entities that would be reflecting the population whose density and ethnic and sectarian makeup was constantly being manipulated. To quote a very prominent international relations scholar by the name of Cal Holsty, quote, "It is not easy to start with something as artificial as a colony and convert it into a highly efficient, effective state." So what I'm trying to tell you is that what you're seeing happening in the Middle East today and before is that once the colonial masters left the area, it was very difficult to establish a viable state on the basis of the boundaries that were drawn by the imperial masters. So, not unexpectedly, in much of the Middle East, the Western idea of a modern state as yet has not taken firm root. With few exceptions, most of the states have fallen short of achieving the phenomena that is well understood in the West, but absent outside of the West, and that is the notion of nation-state. What is the difference between a state versus a nation-state, and why that difference is salient? These are the topics that in the future segment I want to address. But it's a very important concept. Whenever we say the Middle East is not an effective state, we are projecting our own nation statehood into an area that is really not a nation state. In other words, most of the theories we have about the way government functions is rooted in the assumption that the entity we're dealing with is a true nation state. Most of Middle East is a non-nation state. So what is the difference? Those are the type of a promissory note that I have to redeem when we get into the course. Finally, I want to point out that the colonialists, in colonizing the area, they also developed a view of the people under their suzerainty, which made them feel comfortable with. Those views are so important that I'm going to devote a lecture to them under the rubric of perceptual sets. So I'm going to be talking about the imperial stereotype. I'm going to be talking about the colonial stereotype. I'm going to be talking about the barbarian stereotypes. All of these topics have to be addressed much more systematically. I'm just introducing them here so that you will understand the phenomena that we're going to be discussing.